country's efforts on climate action and sustainable development. Before that, she was Special Advisor to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on...
Who is another person breaking new grounds from Nigeria, a gift to the world, Your Excellency Amina Mohammed.
Amina J. Mohammed is the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations.
This timely meeting that is leveraging African trade central to Agenda 2063, but also for financing for development and the means of implementation. Boosting trade between our nations has long been an aspiration of our region and the AFCFTA roadmap. The past 4 years of global economic crisis have underscored the importance of this task today. Multiple shocks have left economies scarred, facing meager growth prospects and in desperate need of economic development to rescue the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2063. The COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and regional conflicts have exposed the vulnerability of global supply chains, including those that are essential, such as food and medical supplies. Policymakers are now left to contend with how to strengthen their economy's resilience. Meanwhile, the multilateral response to global shocks has been both inadequate and highly unequal. That has prompted calls across Africa for our countries to work together, to draw on our collective strengths rather than rely on distant partners whose commitments are not always honored, particularly in times of crisis. These imperatives, accelerated development, stronger resilience, and deeper regional cooperation make the case for deepening intra-African trade compelling and urgent. Over the next 2 days, we will have the chance to discuss many strategies for supporting intra-Africa trade. One is trade facilitation. An estimated $9 billion in additional trade can be unlocked through liberalizing trade on the continent, as envisaged under the African Continental Free Trade Area. Yet, we could unlock at least 5 times that volume by addressing other non-tariff frictions, streamlining and digitalizing border procedures, harmonizing regulations, and investing in transport corridors. Nigeria's recent launch of the Guided Trade Initiative under the ACFTA demonstrates this country's commitment to the strategy. A second strategy to support regional trade is by nurturing a Pan-African payment ecosystem. This will require a holistic approach involving multiple systems and stakeholders. The Pan-African Payment and Settlement System is one such example. Conceived by Afreximbank, working in partnership with central banks and private banks, it provides a foundation to facilitate significantly greater volumes in cross-border payments across our continent. A third strategy is bolstering access to energy and connectivity. Installed electricity capacity in Africa needs to be increased at least 5-fold, and most of this increase can come from the continent's abundant clean energy resources. To realize this goal, African countries have to put in place bankable just energy transition plans. When matched with investors, such efforts can not only facilitate trade, but power broader economic transitions that accelerate development and deliver across Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to commend our African leaders for working together to pursue these strategies, which have the potential to turn the promise of intra-Africa trade into a reality. But we must also recognize the formidable challenges facing African ministers of finance as they pursue these and other goals. Progress on trade facilitation, payment infrastructure, and energy all hinge on public investments. Yet today, developing countries face scant fiscal space. The global funding gap for the SDG investments alone is a staggering $4 trillion a year. The international financial architecture, which is intended to drive international capital where it is most needed, has proven unable to fill this gap. In fact, the funding gap is growing bigger over time. The World Bank, alongside other multilateral development banks, can play a critical role in making investments more affordable by providing low-cost, long-term funding and de-risking private investments. The recent joint commitment by the World Bank and the African Development Bank, working closely with the Sustainable Energy for All initiative to connect 300 million Africans to electricity before 2030, provides a powerful example of what we can do together. But to plug the financing gap, we need these banks to be 3 times their current size. To their credit, the multilateral development banks, led by the World Bank, have embarked on a bold reform. This includes stretching their balance sheets to enable greater volumes of lending and providing more efficiency in the delivery of those volumes. Such efforts are welcome, but ultimately the MDBs will require general capital increases if they're to reach their required size, as recommended by the G20 Independent Expert Group. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we also need desperately action on debt. Today, public investment opportunities must not only compete with each other, they must compete with debt service too. Last year, an extraordinary 48% of government revenue in sub-Saharan Africa alone was devoted to meeting debt payments. It is painfully obvious that such levels of debt service are unsustainable. And that without action, any increase in MDB lending will not yield development dividends, but simply be diverted to hungry creditors. Resolving today's debt crisis requires mobilizing systemic support for countries where debt overhang is stifling SDG spending. At the same time, we must build a new architecture that enables countries to borrow with confidence and invest in the future of their nations. Finally, we must strengthen revenue generation. Boosting public investment depends on it. That requires action from governments, but let us be clear, the promises our countries have made to mobilize domestic resources have not yet been met. They must be reinvigorated. But in today's globalized economy, domestic resource mobilization cannot occur in a vacuum. International cooperation is critical for effective taxation. African leadership has made the case that tax cooperation requires approaches that work for all countries and in which all countries have a voice. Now we have the promise of a framework convention at the United Nations to shape and to strengthen the future cooperation. African leadership was critical in initiating this process, and it remains critical today in guiding the negotiations of an outcome that can win the backing of the global community. Excellencies, African Ministers of Finance have played a vital role in placing these issues on the global agenda. I urge all of us to collaborate in delivering that change, particularly over the next 18 months. This window of opportunity at the Summit of the Future in New York in September, the annual and spring meetings where we must have delivered on the IDA commitments at $105 billion, the G20, COP29, and next year's 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. This agenda is too important to ignore. The protests that we have witnessed in this country and in others are a response to a persistent cost of living crisis that is rooted in global economic turmoil of this era. The importance of our African economies must take center stage. It's time to tackle the root causes, and much of that lies in the international financial architecture. Access to our economies must be had to long-term concessional funding. Others have had it, and it is Africa's turn to be given that right to grow and to prosper for its people. We have the opportunity to drive change, and by doing so, progress towards a vibrant and sustainable future. But this time, one that is determined by the African narrative. So as we work together to boost inter-Africa trade, let us also challenge the current international financial architecture that is not fit for purpose and demand that it responds to the needs and aspirations of the continent and its people, for young people, of which over 60% reside, and for our women. I look forward to caucusing towards a new era of prosperity and attaining the rights and aspirations of every African. Thank you.
Who is another person breaking new grounds from Nigeria, a gift to the world, Your Excellency Amina Mohammed.
Amina J. Mohammed is the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations.